Today I'm going to talk about a book that I really did not like for a variety of reasons. One, the author comes off as a pompous asshole, but two, it's, wading into this thing of Pretendianism. And really, while I personally think it is, in many cases, not significant, this is one where I think, yes, we do actually have to approach this. This book that I'm talking about today is A Year of Moons, Stories from the Adirondack Foothills by Joseph Bruchac. And this came in my box of Fulcrum books from Christmas. So you had a deal where you could get 3 books for $30, all indigenous authorship. So it was really exciting. I got an extra copy of God is Read from Vine Deloria, gave that away. I got a copy of On Indigenuity by Daniel Wildcat. Fantastic book. Daniel Wildcat's a brilliant author. And I also got this. And I'm just going to read you the author, about the author section. So written by, Bruchac himself. Because it kind of tells you everything where you're going to expect to see in the book. Joseph Bruchac lives in the Adirondack Mountain foothills town of Greenfield Center, New York, in the same house where his maternal grandparents raised him. Much of his writing draws on the land and his Native American ancestry. Although his Northeastern American Indian heritage is only one part of an ethnic background that includes Slovak and English blood, those native roots are the one which he has been most nourished. So anybody who is indigenous can kind of see the problem with that. One, it doesn't actually say who you are. Saying you're native or saying you're American Indian doesn't mean anything. Who are your people? And ultimately, it really comes off this book as a person who doesn't actually know or want to know anything about their own community. He knows some words, uses phrases and stuff, but really there's stories in here which are not just from his people, but there's stories borrowed and stolen from communities all throughout the United States. I think there's some stuff in here from Cherokee populations, Creek populations, some Southwestern tribes, Haudenosaunee people. There's stuff inspired by and talked about from really most places except for the Abenaki, which he claims, but which is denied and really aggressively by Canadian Abenaki, First Nations Abenaki people. So what really bothered me about this book is just seeing how the book is allowed to be published and authored and stuff by Fulcrum, who does a lot of indigenous research books, but then they publish this, which is just bizarre. And the question is just a person who can't even say that they are Abenaki in their own bio gets to be an indigenous author, which is interesting to me. So that's really the kind of stuff here. It's this is not a good book. I really would never recommend you buy this book. But if you want to see an example of how someone who is potentially, most likely a Pretendian, writes, and how they promote themselves, and how they highlight themselves, and how they steal from every other community, this is a fantastic example of that. So it is a thing where there has to be a standard. And I think going forward within, the newer generations of indigenous authors, intellectuals, academics, we see that standard, but we still have to reckon with the people who came before when these types of verifications and understanding and nuances of indigenous identity didn't really exist. So that's my big problem with this book. Overall, it just isn't really knowledgeable on anything. It doesn't tell you anything. It comes off as arrogant throughout. The author just is talking about how great his life was, how cool he was, and how he knew so many natives, and here's some of the stories from their people. And the other big thing on here is that there are several indigenous authors who wrote about this book and the positive stuff. We got Tracy Sorrell on here, who wrote Powwow Day, and then a person who I'm not familiar with, Terry Tempest Williams, who's the author of Hour of Land. And my thought is just, did you read this before you endorsed it? Because what is going on here? So overall, really not a fan. I really don't appreciate this book. I really don't appreciate that this was published by a group that is supporting indigenous authors. And I do think that it's important not to support the people who write these types of things or, support them like that, but really read how, people who are not parts of their communities are, truly indigenous, and how they talk about being native and how that differs with people who, are indigenous themselves. Because I think that is a line that we should draw. We should draw a difference between people who are obviously trying to take advantage of an identity that is not theirs versus people who, are struggling through an identity which they are either not familiar with, they don't feel they're living up to, or things like that. So there's a very clear difference here, and I would say this person really sides on the side of probably faking it. So that's the kind of thing. So overall, detest this book, but for really good reasons. And if you have an opportunity to read a sample of this or an example of some of the chapters, I would just say do so. That way you can understand and be prepared for how people who are not truly indigenous write.